All right, let's start off by saying Barakatah Yahweh, Bahashem Yahushai, Bahashem, Racha Kodash. All right, welcome to another live lesson. The name of this one is We Have Identified the Gentiles in the New Testament. And pretty much, there's a lot of videos been going up as of late, going back into the history of the Israelite foreigners, specifically the Hellenization period. As I was speaking right now, I just almost finished watching a video the Elder Pastor did, going into, pretty much the same topic. His video is called How the Israelites Became Gentiles. How the Israelites became Gentiles, Greeks. Yep. So pretty much, this is the spirit, Elder Apostle Gabar he started this week. So him and the Elder Bishop Sakaran are going to be doing, covering the book of Ephesians, dealing with that part of the history. So we did the first chapter we did, this Tuesday. The Spirit has been on me for the last week and a half, almost 2 weeks, to go and dive into Ephesians, the second chapter, because that is one of the chapters that these so-called apologists, replacement theology, supersessionism individuals like to use to try to incorporate all nations in there, and it just doesn't work for you when you understand the true breakdown of Ephesians, the second chapter. And I've mentioned it before. You can dive into all these different theological terms and memorize all this stuff. You've gone to schools and colleges and paid all this money to get all this, so-called pseudo education. And for some reason, you could do deep dives into all the Greek words and everything, Hebrew words, and exegesis this and exegesis that and exegete this and extra cheese that. But for some reason, when it comes to the word reconciled, you just draw a blank, or is that done intentionally? Well, we know the answer to that one. But nevertheless, what I did was I typed in, I've done this before, I typed in Hellenization of Jews, or of the Jews, right? It says the Hellenization of the Jews was the process of cultural and religious assimilation that began after Alexander the Great's conquest in 332 BC. They say BCE, before the Common Era. Some say BC, before Christ, the Messiah, which we will go with the BY, before Yahushai. Right? It says leading Jews to adopt Greek language, customs, and philosophy while also engaging with Greek institutions like gymnasiums and theaters. This resulted in a new form of Hellenistic Judaism, characterized by both integration, example given Greek names, the Septuagint translation, which was translated by Ptolemy II Philadelphus, which was the son of Ptolemy the First Soter, which means savior. That was the father. That was the first of the line of the Ptolemy. So Ptolemy the First, and his son was the one that had the Septuagint translated into, or the Hebrew Old Testament translated into the Greek, which they call the Septuagint, at the request of his librarian. His librarian said that the Jews had many books that were worthy of translating into the Greek, and that's why you get the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, known as the Septuagint, which means 70. There were 72 priests, I believe they were, that went down from Israel down into Alexandria, Egypt, where you had a large community of Israelites. All right, and they translated it. There was a whole story behind it. And some of it is tradition. But nevertheless, they went down there and translated the scriptures into the Greek for the Greek-speaking Israelites that were keeping the customs. Now, to understand that, you had those that knew that they were Greeks. I'm sorry, you had those that knew that they were Israelites, spoke the Greek language, lived in Greek, regions, but they still kept the law, statutes, and commandments. All right, that's what this here was for. When the Septuagint was for, the other Israelites cared not for anything that had to do with Israel, because by the time the New Testament era, or the first century AD, Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, came about, you had Israelites that were totally assimilated into the Greek culture, Greek language, and had no idea or clue who they were. Right? So it says, characterize this resulted in a new form of Hellenistic Judaism, characterized by both integration, example given Greek names, the Septuagint translation, and resistance, example given the Maccabean revolt. So the Israelites that revolted, they weren't speaking the Greek language. They weren't, getting into anything or any custom of the Greeks, their religion, none of that. They fought against that. So they would not be considered, Hellenistes, which there's a difference between Hellenistes and a difference between Hellene. All right, let's come back to that. When we go to Acts chapter 6 and 1, right, it says, and in those days when the number of the disciples was multiplied, this is after the apostle Peter and the other apostles set up a commune where everyone brought everything, and they brought all whether it was homes, they sold it, they pooled all the money together, all the resources together, to be able to distribute to the poor, to the rest of Israel, from one central location, so to speak. But it was supposed to be done in righteousness. But these individuals that were over it, they were being partial, because they were giving to the Israelites that spoke Hebrew the benefits, or the help. But the ones that spoke the Greek, they were kind of pushing them to the curb, so to speak. So it says, in those days when the number of the disciples was multiplied, there arose a murmuring of the Grecians against the Hebrews, because their widows were neglected in the daily ministration. So now, when we look up this word Grecian in the Greek language, right? These were Israelites that had a beef with other Israelites. They had there was a fault here. So these Israelites that spoke Greek had a beef with the ones that spoke Hebrew, because of the neglecting that was going on. So when you look up the word Grecians, you have the word Hellenistes, which here you see it says a Hellenistic or Greek speaking Jew, Grecian. Now scroll down, a Hellenist, one who imitates the manners and customs or the worship of the Greeks and use the Greek tongue. It's really this would really fall under the category of Hellene, one who imitates the manners, because this is what happened to the other Israelites. But here in the number 2, it says, used in the New Testament of Jews born in foreign lands and speaking Greek. So basically, this is really the definition here. This is the definition right here. And this goes back to the origins or the group word of Hellene. But before we go there, used in the New Testament of Jews born in foreign lands and speaking Greek. And that's what it was, because they were keeping the law, statutes, and commandments. This is why they will come to Jerusalem, 3 times a year, as ordained in the law. Let's go to that real quick. Deuteronomy 16. It says, 3 times in a year shall all thy males appear before the Lord Yahweh B'Shem Yahushai power in the place which he shall choose, which, after everything was set up and established during the time of King Solomon, that's when the temple was set up in Jerusalem, and that became the center of worship for Israel. So the Lord said, 3 times in a year, all of thy males shall appear before the Lord in the place which he shall choose, in the feast of unleavened bread, which is the Passover, And in the Feast of Weeks, which is the ingathering, or what they call, I'm sorry, not the ingathering, the what they call Pentecost, or the Feast of First Fruits, and in the Feast of Tabernacles, and they shall not appear before the Lord empty. Right. So these two feasts here, the Feast of Weeks, or the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Feast of Weeks, they were around the same time period. Because after the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or the Passover, is finished for that week, what would happen is you would count 50 days. All right. And there's, it's more to it. I'm just giving you like something briefly. Then when you get to the 50th day, that would be the last day, which would be the Feast of Weeks, which you will bring the first fruits to the Lord, offering of your land, because by this was the first crop that you would get. Right. And then in the Feast of Tabernacles, which would be in the 7th month, you had the memorial of blowing of the trumpets, the first day of the month, which is the new moon, which is the Sabbath. Then 9 days later, which was the 9th at evening, into the 10th, you had the Day of Atonement. And then a few more days later, which is the 15th day, or 14th day at evening, which is the 15th day, that would be the Feast of Tabernacles. So the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Passover, during the Passover week, the Feast of Weeks, the first fruits, and in the Feast of Tabernacles, and they shall not appear before the Lord empty. This is why you had these individuals that spoke the Greek language that were coming to Jerusalem, all right, in these times. And then some of them were actually living there, but a lot of them still lived in Alexandria. And when you read further down into this chapter, it tells you that these were libertines. There were Cyrenians. They were from Alexandria. They were Alexandrian Jews that spoke the Greek language. This is why you had Apollos. Apollos, he had a Greek name. So if he had a Greek name, that means he spoke the Greek language, but he also spoke the Hebrew. So and I would have to do more research on that, because the scriptures don't bring that out. So I want to, clarify that, because you say, all right, because how these guys, they hang on every little thing you say, like women. But anyways, Hellenization, these are Greek-speaking Jews. All right. Now, when you go to the root word of it, Hellene, this would be the category that the Israelites would fall under, that forsook everything, that lost their way, that just dealt with the Greek. But this term could also apply to other nations, because the other nations, they actually, went and were Hellenized. But in the New Testament, we read the New Testament, this is dealing with the Israelites that were, caught up in that, Hellenization period that took place during the time of the Greeks, when the Greeks were in power. And that's why it says here, Hellene, a Greek either by nationality, because you had the Japhetic people were the original so-called Greeks, which were dark-skinned people, brown-skinned people. Then the Edomites, the so-called white men under Philip II and Alexander, they came in and they took over and they started calling themselves Greeks. And then when they conquered the known world, they brought the Greek influence upon all these different people. So this was a great Hellenization period, roughly from around 333, 332 BC, all the way until the time of the Roman Empire. So it says a Greek either by nationality, whether a native of the mainland or of the Greek islands or colonies. In a wider sense, the name embraces all nations, not Jews, and that's not the case, because you had Israelites that were being called Hellene or Greeks that didn't know that they were Israelites. Point blank, or the thing that points to that is the Israelites that were in Caesar's service. Now should I say the ones that were in Caesar's service, they knew that they were Israelites. Like Tiberius Julius Alexander, he knew he was an Israelite, and many others. But you had those that didn't know, and he didn't care for Israel. He didn't care. He loved the customs and the manners and the perks that he got from being a Greek and following the Greek customs more than anything that had to do with Israel. Because remember, Israel back then was being persecuted. Matter of fact, let's get real quick and we'll come right back to this. So why did the Israelites in the book of First Maccabees, the first chapter, why did they cleave to the customs of the Greeks? Because they received benefits. And it says, since we left, from dealing with the heathen, we have had much sorrow. I'm just merely paraphrasing. So that's why they chose to sell out. And this is why the Israelites later on, during the time of Yahushua, and even prior to that, had a great disdain for those that sold out their nation and became Greeks. So they pretty much looked at them as you guys are, you guys are gone. There's no more hope for you. This is why this is another reason why Yahushua had to come on the scene. So Matthew chapter 11, verse 11. I'm sorry, 11. Verily I say unto you, among them that are born of women, there hath not risen a greater than John the Baptist. Notwithstanding, he that is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. And from the days of John the Baptist until now, even at that present moment, the kingdom of heaven, the Israelites, suffereth violence, and the violent take it by force. So pretty much the Roman militaries were putting hell on Jake. The Roman, government was putting hell on Jake because they were taxing, overtaxing. And they every year, they had to go back to the place where they were born to pay taxes. And then they were being crucified. All kind of shit was going on back then. So they were catching hell. So going back to the Greek Empire, it was the same thing. So you had Israelites that sold out in the Greek Empire because they wanted the benefits and the perks of the heathen, because they didn't want to suffer, like the other Israelites were suffering. So they would fall under the category of the Hellene or Greeks, like Timothy's father. And we made this point over and over again, that here it is, Lois, which was the grandmother, and Eunice, which was the daughter. Sometimes you get them mixed up. But Lois, the grandmother, Eunice, the mother. Eunice married Timothy's father, who was classified as a Greek in the scriptures. It doesn't go into any detail, but we know that being that Lois, the grandmother, and Eunice, the mother, were devout Israelites, there was no way that the grandmother or Timothy's grandmother or his mother would have married a heathen. That just would not have happened, because she was devout. And the reason why Timothy wasn't circumcised was because she, being an Israelite woman, she honored her husband. And her husband, being that he was caught up into that Greek philosophy and Greek ways, he didn't allow his son to get circumcised. And she wasn't going to go against those wishes because, she had to stay in her place. But nevertheless, she was still devout. And I'm sure, his father's probably eating pork and all that shit, because he was into that shit. But she wouldn't touch it, So it says, in a wider sense, name embraces all nations, not Jews. It also embraces Israelites that didn't know that they were Israelites, that made the language, customs, and learning of the Greeks their own. See, the primary reference is to a difference of religion and worship. And that's what set it off, because you had Persians that spoke the Greek language and kept their, religious rites. You had Hamites that were Hellenized, that kept their customs and their laws, but they were still speaking the Greek language and following the Greek customs. It was like a dual worship, so to speak. All right, so you can understand. Then you had Israelites that just totally lost their way, which would be classified under the scope of Hellene or Hellene. It's not that hard, and that's why it doesn't say there's no difference between the Jew and and the oikoumene, or the whole world, or there's no difference between a Jew and a Hamite. There's no difference between a Jew and a Moabite. There's no difference between a Jew and a Ishmaelite. Why did it use specifically Greek? Because you had Israelites that got caught up in that fray, and the reason why there's no difference is because they're Israelites. It's just one speaking the Hebrew, the other one speaking the Greek. One's following the law, statutes, and commandments. The other one's following the ways of the nations, or specifically the Greeks, the Edomite Greeks. All right. So going back, let's read this again. Now that you got a better understanding as to when it says about the Grecians here, who these Grecians are. And in those days, when the number of the disciples was multiplied, there arose a murmuring of the Grecians, or the Greek-speaking Jews, against the Hebrews, the Hebrew-speaking Israelites, Jews, because their widows were neglected in the daily ministration, right? Because they were, they were showing favoritism to the ones that spoke Hebrew and not to the ones that spoke Greek, even though they were both Israelites. And when we go to Matthew 18, right? Let's go to Matthew chapter 18. And this is going into, when a brother trespasses against you, right? You go between that man and himself. That doesn't mean if a brother's breaking the scriptures down wrong, you go to him, look, brother, you breaking the scriptures down wrong, because these unlearned Israelites out here try to, well, look, if they had a problem with him, they want to talk to him about the doctrine, they should have just came to that brother, himself, like it says it. No. See, you guys don't know the scriptures like that. This is talking about if there's a fault between two men, you will go to that man himself and speak to him. If he did something to you, if he trespassed against you, or if he offended you, you will go to that man alone. That's what this is talking about. Not, okay, this man's teaching about hell. There's no such thing as hell. So now I got to rebuke him. But before I can rebuke him before everybody, I got to go to him. No, that's not what this is talking about. So when you read down, if he doesn't listen to that man, he will bring 2 or 3 witnesses. If he doesn't listen to the 2 or 3 witnesses, you will bring him to the church, to the council, to the congregation. And if he still refuses to listen and doesn't take heed and doesn't apologize, doesn't, mend his ways, so to speak, this is what happens. Verse 17, and if he neglect to hear them, meaning the church, after you speak to him, after you bring 2 or 3 witnesses, and after you bring him before the church, right? And if he neglect to hear them, tell it unto the church, right? But if he neglect to hear the church, let him be unto thee as what? As an heathen man and a publican, an outcast, because the publicans were detested, even though they were Israelites. Just like these Greek-speaking Israelites, and following the customs of the Israelites, they were looked down upon. So if you went against the order, you were cast out as a heathen man, or as a heretic, or as an apostate. And there's a whole history on the apostates. Elder Yashawamba just went into, a video dealing with, Samaria, and the different dealings that was going on in the history of that, and then when you go to the Josephus, it tells you about, the apostate Jews that fled to Samaria for refuge. And this is why they called Yahushua a Samaritan, because back then that was considered a great insult to call somebody a Samaritan. You see, because they were known to be apostates, and you didn't want to have that label on you of an apostate or a heretic or anything of that nature. Definitely didn't want to be called a Samaritan. So when we go here, so if he doesn't listen to the church, he'd be casted out as a heathen man and a publican. Let's go to this word heathen man. This is an Israelite now. Because what sense does it make if you bring a heathen and a Gentile, and then he don't listen, and you cast him out and let him be as a heathen man? What sense does that make? He's a heathen, So the word heathen here goes to the word ethnikos. Which the brother, I don't remember the brother's name, Salakia, the brother out of Detroit. I believe he's just either second or third in command of the Detroit camp. He was going into this, and I've gone into this before, but he was going deeper into it with the ethnikos, right? When you look at the word ethnikos, it says here national, ethnic, an example, especially a Gentile heathen man, which goes back to the word ethnos. So let him be treated as the ethnic group of those heathens. So what happened? He became what? A heathen. Because he was casted out. Matter of fact, let's go real quick to Romans chapter 2 and verse 25. This is another good one. It says, for circumcision verily profiteth, if thou keep the law. But if thou be a breaker of the law, so if you break the law, right, thy circumcision is made uncircumcision. This is why when you go to Ephesians chapter 2, we're going to come right back to this, and verse 11, Salakia, right? It says what? Wherefore remember that you, being in time past Gentiles in the flesh, you Israelites that are in this Gentile state of mind, you were Gentiles in the flesh because you were born that way. Because when you go back in the history, your forefathers chose the way of the Greeks, and they passed that on to their children and their children's children and their children's children. So by the time you get to the third, fourth generation and above, the whole identity of being an Israelite is wiped out. So you grow up thinking you're a Greek, speaking Greek, eating Greek food, worshiping Greek gods, not being circumcised, the males. So this is why the Apostle Paul said that to them, right? It says, who are called uncircumcision by that which is called the circumcision in the flesh made by hands, which are who? The Jews in Jerusalem that were born into the law, that circumcised their sons the 8th day. They were looking at you as heathens. Okay? So going back to the word, to this Romans 2:25, for circumcision verily profiteth if thou keep the law. But if thou be a breaker of the law, like those Israelites that chose the way of the Greeks, broke the law, thy circumcision is made uncircumcision. And that happened during the time of the Greek Empire, specifically during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. Now we'll go to First Maccabees, the first chapter, right? And if you start from the first verse, it gives you the history of Alexander, how he conquered and how he split his kingdom, right? But now when we jump down to the 11th verse, it says, in those days went there out of Israel wicked men. See, these were wicked men who persuaded many, saying, many who? Many Israelites. Let us go and make a covenant with the heathen, make an agreement with the heathen, right? And that are round about us, for since we departed from them, we have had much sorrow. So they wanted the perks. They didn't want to catch hell. They didn't want to get put to death. They didn't want to suffer. So they sold out. So the Israelites that didn't sell out looked at these guys as sellouts, as heathens, as scumbags, as lowlifes, which no longer had any hope. They were just totally gone. So this device pleased them well. Then certain of the people were so forward there herein, and that they went to the king, who gave them license to do after the ordinance of the heathen, which is a gymnasium that they built, whereupon they built a place of exercise at Jerusalem according to the custom of the heathen, and made themselves what? Uncircumcised. Now the men made themselves uncircumcised physically, certain ones of them. They went and, because if you follow the customs of the Greeks, and their manner is to exercise in the nude, and they see that you don't have a turtleneck on your joint, right? Then they say, oh, you're a Jew. You're not a Greek. So they made it to where being circumcised was an embarrassment. So they went to the painful, just like when you're a baby, you don't remember that, you get the turtleneck cut off, you don't remember. But then when you're a grown-ass man and you're trying to sew the turtleneck back on, that shit is painful. But they went through that procedure in order to be able to be accepted. And they also became uncircumcised in their heart, and made themselves uncircumcised, and forsook the holy covenant, and joined themselves to the heathen, and were sold to do mischief. This is why they were looked down upon and called the uncircumcision by the Jews that were called the circumcision. It's easy when you understand the history. So back in Romans 2:25, let's read that again. For circumcision verily profiteth if thou keep the law, but if thou be a breaker of the law, you break the law like these Hellenized Israelites did, thy circumcision is made uncircumcision. You're a heathen. Matter of fact, let's go to the word uncircumcision. Let's see what that says. In the Greek, The word there is acrobustia, having a foreskin. See, uncircumcised. Right. What's the foreskin? That's that little, turtleneck that goes around, the tip of your joint. A Gentile, see, uncircumcised, a condition in which the corrupt desires rooted in the flesh were not yet extinct. That's why it said they became uncircumcised in their heart, something like that. Let me see something. So we got that. Circumcised. Let's see. Right here. Jeremiah 9 and 26, 25. Behold, the days come, saith the Lord Yahweh Shemashah, that I will punish all them that are circumcised, the Israelites, with the uncircumcised, the heathen. Egypt and Judah and Edom and the children of Ammon and Moab and all that are in the utmost corners that dwell in the wilderness. For all these nations are uncircumcised, and all the house of Israel are uncircumcised in their heart, or in the heart. This is why the Apostle Paul said you have to be born again, because you became uncircumcised. Let me get that real quick. Matter of fact, let me go back here. Let's go to Ephesians 4, and we'll come right back. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 20. But you have not so learned Yahushua, so be that you have heard him and have been taught by him, as the truth is in Yahushua. Ephesians 4:20 on down. That ye put off concerning the former conversation the old man, which is corrupt according to the deceitful lust, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind. Renewed in the spirit of your mind, and that you put on the new man, which after the Most High is created in righteousness and true holiness, so that what? You can be cleaned back up, and your foolish heart can be circumcised again now. Let's look up the word renewed. Renewed. The word there is ananeo, to renew in the mind. See? To be renewed in the mind. So going back to Romans 2, right? If you break the law, your circumcision becomes uncircumcision. The uncircumcision, once again, is acrobustia, having a foreskin uncircumcised, a Gentile, condition in which the corrupt desires rooted in the flesh were not yet extinct. And that's why the Apostle Paul spoke about that your understanding being darkened. Right? Let's see. Okay. Right here, Ephesians 4 and 18. Matter of fact, because I want to get that. Ephesians 4:17. This I say therefore and testify in the Lord, that you henceforth walk not as other Gentiles walk. Don't walk like those other Israelites that are Gentiles. Don't walk like them anymore. Yeah, I know you're cool with some of them. Some of them are family members, but don't walk like that anymore. Right? In the vanity of your mind, because you were not subjected to the laws of Yahweh Bashem Yahushua at this time. Having the understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of the Most High through the ignorance that is in them because of the blindness of their heart. So Jake was always going off. Jake was always worshiping idols. And that's one of the main crimes that caused the Most High to cast us out of the land. It says, who being past feeling have given themselves over unto lasciviousness to work all uncleanness with greediness. Yeah, because you at one point, you knew that what you were doing was wrong, but after a while, that feeling of guilt left because you started getting deeper and deeper into that wickedness. This is why, like when you see two Jakes that are moles and they're walking down the street holding hands, sweet as can be, and then they come around real men, other so-called black men, other Jakes, they stop holding hands and they straighten up because they know that's wicked. And many other examples that could be used. All right, so let's go back. Now, when you go to Ephesians, the first chapter, which we covered this week, it says here, the eyes of your understanding being enlightened. Why? Because you were in darkness, your heart was uncircumcised. Now you're circumcised again, you Israelites. That you may know what is the hope of his calling and what the riches of the glory of his inheritance in the saints. Why? Because you are also saints. But you went way off, and now you had to be brought way back. That's why it speaks about, to seek the old paths. So going back here, let's read this again, just to hammer the point home. So it says here, for Romans 2:25, for circumcision verily profiteth if thou keep the law. But if thou be a breaker of the law, thy circumcision is made uncircumcision. Okay? You become a heathen, just like we read in Matthew 18th chapter, verse 26, excuse me. Therefore, if the uncircumcision, the Israelite foreigners, the sellouts, the ones that were looked down upon, the ones that were called Gentiles and heathens, Israelite foreigners, keep the righteousness of the law, so they come and start to keep the righteousness of the law, right? Shall not their uncircumcision be counted for circumcision? And that's what Yahushua was for, to bring them back into the covenant. This is why in Ephesians 2, it speaks about reconciliation. In the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 5, and we can start at 16. Wherefore henceforth know we no man after the flesh, yea, though we have known Yahushua after the flesh, yet now henceforth know we him no more. Therefore, if any man be in Yahushua, right, any Israelite man be in Yahushua, he is a new creature. Why? Because you are reborn. Old things are passed away, those old heathen ways. Behold, all things are become new, and all things are of the Most High, who hath reconciled us to himself by Yahushua. That was a reconciliation. All things are passed away. Behold, all things become. And all things are of the Most High, who hath reconciled us to himself by Yahushua, and hath given to us the ministry of reconciliation. To wit, or to know that the Most High was in Yahushua, reconciling the world, Israelites, unto himself, not imputing their trespasses, their breaking of the law, unto them, because the laws were only given to the nation of Israel, and hath committed unto us the word of reconciliation. That's 4 times, for his mercy. Reconcile, reconciliation, right? You look up the word reconciled. Katalasso, right? To change, exchange as coins for others or equivalent. That's one definition. To reconcile those who are at variance. So how do we become at variance? We worship these different idols. You know that you were Gentiles carried away unto these dumb idols, even as you were led. So we were at variance with the Most High. He looked at us like, nah, I don't recognize y'all. These are not the children that I brought up. It says, return to favor with, be reconciled to one, to receive one into favor. Now, let's go back. Let's go to the word reconciliation, right? This one is katalage, right? It says exchange of the business of money exchange. This dealing with one definition of exchange of money. Adjustment of difference, reconciliation, restore. Okay, adjustment of a difference, reconciliation, restoration to favor. Okay, in the New Testament, of the restoration of the favor of the Most High to sinners, which are the Israelites, that repent and put their trust in the expiatory death of Yahushua. Now, there's another one Let's see what the other one down here says. Reconciliation, we just looked that up. Reconcile. Let's see what reconciling says, because there's another definition. If not, we'll go to Ephesians chapter 2. I believe the one in Ephesians chapter 2 is apokatalasso. Catalasso, yeah, pretty much it says the same thing. So let's go back. I want to make sure we go back to Romans 2 before we go to Ephesians 2, right? Right here, verse 16. And that he might reconcile both, right? The ones that knew that they were Israelites and the ones that didn't, unto the Most High in one body by the cross, having slain the enmity thereby, and came and preached peace to you which were far off. Did I miss the point here? Right, that he might reconcile both unto the Most High. So like it right here. Reconcile. Yep. Apokatalasso. Apokatalasso. Through reconciliation, pretty much. To reconcile completely, to reconcile back again, bring back a former state of harmony. What was that former state of harmony? When the Lord, joined us to him by his law, statutes, and commandments, which is what made us saints or holy. He didn't do that with anybody else. Let's go real quick. Psalms chapter 50 and verse 5. It says, gather my saints together unto me, those that have made a covenant with me by sacrifice. Everybody didn't make a covenant with the Most High by sacrifice. Only the Israelites. So he's saying, gather my saints unto me, the Israelites. So going back to Romans chapter 2 and 26. Therefore, if the uncircumcision, the Israelite foreigners, keep the righteousness of the law, shall not his uncircumcision be counted as circumcision? So this is what was happening. This is what the grafting back in was about. The grafting of these Gentiles or Israelite foreigners was for them to get back to the circumcision of their mind, of their heart. It says, and shall not uncircumcision, which is by nature, if it fulfill the law, judge thee, who by the letter and circumcision does transgress the law? Yeah, because they're going to look at you. Wait a minute, you told us to keep the law. You ain't keeping the law. For he is not a Jew, which is one outwardly. Right, it's not just about what you appear like on the outside, because Yahushua proved that. When he said, you appear outside as whited walls, but inside you are full of dead men's bones. Neither is there circumcision, which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew, which is one inwardly, right? Because it begins with the change from inside. That's what the Apostle Paul was telling these Israelite foreigners. And circumcision is that of the heart in the spirit and not in the letter, whose praise is not of men, but of the Most High, right? And eventually, once you fully persuaded in your own mind, you would want to get circumcised. You would want to come back to your, and I'm sure some of those Israelite foreigners, it's not written, some of them, Timothy, he would be considered like an Israelite foreigner, he was circumcised. And eventually some of them probably got circumcised, and started keeping the law, started keeping the Passover. Why would the Apostle Paul speak about the Passover and somebody eating unworthily to the Corinthians if they weren't eating the Passover? But it was baby steps that had to be taken at first. So pretty much, we have identified who the Gentiles in the New Testament are. And with that, I pray that you brothers and few sisters have been edified. Till the next time I say, Shalom.